Honourable colleagues, I rise today to speak to Bill C-45, the bill legalizing the use of marijuana. I've been deliberately quiet on this bill up until now, not because I don't have strong feelings on the legalization of illicit drugs, but because as a legislator, it is incumbent on me to put those feelings in check and listen to the information being presented to me. I wanted to hear from experts, I wanted to hear from the ministers and from my colleagues. And now that I have, I am more convinced than ever that this is a step in the wrong direction if I've ever seen one. I have listened to the sponsor of this bill and several of my colleagues, and I have listened to the Ministers of Health, Justice and Public Safety. And none of what I've heard has answered any of the questions a lot of Canadians, myself included, have about this bill. If anything, we seem to be left with more questions than answers. Chief among them, how and why. Let's start with the how. How is this legislation going to do the number one thing the government says it will do? Prevent young people from accessing marijuana. How? The theory is legalizing marijuana will make it more difficult for kids to access the black market. Okay, how? I've yet to hear an actual explanation. I've yet to hear even an attempt at an actual explanation. What I do hear a lot is that the current approach isn't working. Senator Mitchell just said that at the start of his speech. That doesn't answer any question. It does raise other questions, like how do we know our current approach isn't working? And did we look at any other approaches as solutions? I'll get to those questions shortly. But first, how does legalizing marijuana lead to a decrease in use amongst youth? How do we know it does? While some people point to other jurisdictions to show a correlation between legalization and a decrease in youth usage, the science is far from settled. A major hurdle, as we heard from the Minister of Health, Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor, during Committee of the Whole, is the difficulty in establishing accurate baseline statistics. As the Minister stated, there is a challenge in getting accurate research on usage because of the illegality of marijuana in Canada. The same was true for Colorado, which legalized recreational marijuana in 2012, providing a good case study for what we might expect here in Canada. Andrew Friedman, Colorado's former director of marijuana coordination, has said, and I quote him, "One of the things we didn't do as well as we could have is set great baseline data. We were not measuring some of the things that were really important to us, like how many kids were being suspended from school for marijuana use. We were not measuring that, which meant we didn't have a way to know if that changed after we legalized. Making sure you're measuring things that matter to you so that you can change policy along the way is really important," end of quote. So have we done that here? Are we learning from Colorado's mistakes? Have we, or are we doing all the research we can to improve our chances of setting an accurate baseline data? Not according to the Parliamentary Secretary Bill Blair, who has been stick-handling this bill through Parliament. I find it interesting that during a recent funding announcement for research, Mr. Blair said, and I quote him, "There's an absence of evidence that should be informing policy," end of quote. That's from the government's own point man on this legislation, colleagues. As for any correlation between Colorado's legalization of marijuana and the rates of usage among young people, Dr. Larry Wolk, the Chief Medical Officer at the Department of Public Health and Environment in the state of Colorado, said, and I quote him, "What it looks like is folks who have been using illicitly before are using legally now, and teens or youth who were using illicitly before, it's still the same rate of illicit use." In other words, legalizing an activity doesn't mean the activity is no longer occurring. It just means it's not occurring illegally. And it's not just Colorado. As pointed out by my colleague Senator Seidman in a question to the Minister of Health, research from around the world suggests that marijuana legalization would lead to more usage among young people. Senator Seidman cited the PLOS One study from 2015, which showed 38 countries where marijuana liberalization is associated with higher levels of regular marijuana use amongst teenagers. For a government that said it would always take science-based approach, they seem to be cherry-picking research on marijuana usage to suit their narrative. And in the case of the mother of all stats as far as legislation is concerned, this current government can't even tell us where it comes from, never mind the methodology applied. And I'm referring to the claim that Canada has the world's highest marijuana use amongst young people. That is the impetus for this legislation, after all. It is the impetus for the constant pressure to pass the legislation forthwith. and is that claim on which the government bases its argument that our current approach isn't working. However, there seems to be a great deal of confusion as to the origin of the statistic and therefore the validity of all claims originating from it. We've been told the statistic comes from a 2013 UNICEF report. We've been told time and time again in this place. That report cites Canada's Department of Justice 2008 as its source. Yet when a Blacklock's reporter asked Justice Canada about the origin and methodology of the statistic, the department replied, "Given the time that's lapsed and the lack of specific context on the source, we're not sure where the 2008 statistic cite would have come from." How can this government claim our current approach isn't working and that we need to legalize marijuana based on a statistic that doesn't stand up to the most basic of scrutiny, which is where does it come from and what methodology was used? Remember, colleagues, I asked the government leader to provide that methodology in this chamber. It's been a number of weeks. I'm still waiting. I think for many Canadians, I can probably stop right here, and on that basis alone, they would feel this legislation is not ready. But colleagues, I'm just getting started. Earlier, I asked what other approaches were considered by this government, if any, or was it just legalization or bust? Senator Carignan asked the Minister of Health if her government had looked at measures implemented in Norway that have resulted in that country having the world's lowest rate of usage among young people. Wouldn't that be worth studying, worth looking at? We didn't get an answer. I would like one. I believe Canadians deserve one. I want to go back to Parliamentary Secretary Bill Blair's research funding announcement for a moment. Why is it, if this legislation is so very important that it must pass without delay, why is it that this government just now making research dollars available and just now embarking on crucial research? For instance, just before we rose a few weeks ago, colleagues, Statistics Canada announced that they would be conducting an analysis of municipal wastewater to provide a more accurate picture of non-medical marijuana use by Canadians. From their release, Statistics Canada said, and I quote them, this is the department, this is their release. Given the difficulty in obtaining this information and the level of data required by data users, Statistics Canada is using non-traditional methods to acquire as much information as possible. One such method is the use of wastewater analysis to measure drug consumption levels in the general population. And here's the kicker, colleagues. This type of research is not new. It's been performed in various countries for over a decade. That leaves me shaking my head. We have a piece of legislation before us that we're being told we must pass without delay, told that the safety and well-being of our children depends on it, legislation that was by their own admission a priority of this government, and only now the government is beginning undertaking critical research? Why? See, there's the why. Why, if this is so important, would we just be doing this now? This government has admitted that there's a challenge in establishing accurate baseline data. Yet here's the type of research that has been used successfully to help mitigate that challenge, and we're just now beginning to undertake the study? That's irresponsible. I mean, it's not like this government hasn't had time. As Senator Pratt is so fond of pointing out, it was a promise in their campaign platform, and they've been in power for almost 3 years. So why are they just now undertaking research that is so crucial to this legislation? And research isn't the only thing lagging. We heard a lot from the ministers when they were here about the importance of education, that educating young people about the dangers of marijuana use and of driving high were a major component of this bill. While Budget 2018 announced $62.5 million in education initiatives, this money will not start to flow until after this government's legislation timeline. Why the delay again? Why are we not seeing any education initiatives on television, on radio, in newspapers, and social media? Why are we legalizing marijuana before allowing some of that education to start taking place first and foremost? Again, we need to look no further than Colorado to see that this approach is ill-advised. Minister Fitzpatrick herself said, if there's one thing Colorado wishes they had done differently when they legalized recreational marijuana, is that they would have made sure that public awareness was in place beforehand. Yet when asked by Senator Smith about her government's timeline for implementing their education program, Minister Fitzpatrick responded that they were in the process of, again, developing the program. That's great. They've not only not only implemented it, they have not implemented it, they haven't even developed it yet. Another problem. Have they followed their own task force recommendations on the development? The recommendation that Indigenous communities and elders be consulted on the design and delivery of public education. Has this government fully considered the impact this legislation is going to have on Indigenous youth in this country? The minister said they have consulted, and no doubt they have. However, as I sat here and I listened to Senator Patterson's speech, what I heard gave me great pause. What I took away from that speech was much like every other aspect of this legislation. This government has done the bare minimum when it comes to preparing for the reality of this implementation. What they have done is left the lion's share to the provinces and territories to do the heavy lifting. Senator Patterson made it quite clear that mayors across Nunavut do not feel like they were heard. They do not feel they are ready. They worry immensely about the young people in their communities. For a government that says it is committed to reconciliation with Indigenous people in this country, I'm actually quite taken aback that they don't appear to be taking their concerns more seriously. In that regard, I can't help but think back and ask why. Why did this chamber refuse to have the Minister of Indigenous Affairs come here to testify at the Committee of the Whole? I'm going to take the issue of education initiatives one step further and go back to the question of whether this government considered other approaches for decreasing the use among young people. Did this government even contemplate an approach of focusing more on education or youth about the dangers of marijuana as a deterrent? We have had great success with that approach when it comes to cigarette smoking. Smoking amongst Canadian young people has decreased thanks in large part to education. And yet public health experts, including the Canadian Cancer Society, warn us that legalizing marijuana will undermine that success because of the mixed messaging and renormalizing of tobacco use. The topic of cigarette smoking brings me to another question raised during Committee of the Whole by my colleague Senator Carignan, using the example of lawsuits against tobacco companies. Senator Carignan asked if this government had sought any legal opinions on the risk of class action lawsuits against the Government of Canada. Suits that could result in taxpayers being on the hook for billions of dollars. The answer? No. Despite having almost 3 years in power, this government has sought not a single legal opinion on the very real risk that comes along with the legalization of marijuana. Why? Why have they not done so? Over and over again, we keep hearing about the importance of not just passing this legislation, but doing so quickly. It's urgent, they say. Yet it is clear this government hasn't done its part to show Canadians that this legislation is on the right course of action and that is being undertaken in the most responsible of ways. They don't have the science to support their claims that we even need this legislation, let alone that it will do what they claim it will. They're just now beginning crucial research just a few weeks ago that would serve to best inform our decisions on this bill. They haven't developed, never mind implemented, an education program. They haven't sought prudent legal opinions. And what about the impact of this legislation on those who will have to enforce it? More and more police chiefs have come out across Canada saying they're not ready. They're saying they don't have the training in place. They don't have the equipment for detection of drug impairment. They don't have the funding for the training or the equipment. And what about the courts? We're told another benefit of this legislation is that our courts will no longer be clogged up with people fighting marijuana-related criminal charges. But again, as my colleague Senator Batters pointed out, if anything, this legislation will result in the courts being more backed up because of the impaired driving charges. And when Senator Batters questioned the Justice Minister about why her government chose legislation rather than decriminalization to address the backlog issue, Minister Wilson-Raybould did not provide any answer again. Lots of questions, few if any answers. At the end of the day, this legislation aspires to great things, but falls way, way short. This legislation is not ready, colleagues, and Canadians aren't ready for it. Not in its current form, not even close. I started my speech today asking how. I will end it by asking why. Why are we rushing this legislation? Is it to satisfy the election promise by a government that has broken so many of them anyways? Is it to pay for promises yet to come? Promises of a tax and spend government that knows no limits and no bounds? Are we pushing through legislation to pay for this government out-of-control spending grant? Paying for it on the backs of our children and your grandchildren? We hear a lot about the well-being of our children if this legislation isn't passed. Well, I am concerned about the well-being of our children if this legislation is passed, and that's why I'm against it. Thank you, colleagues.
Do you have a question, Senator Dean?
Question, please.
Senator Uzakos, excuse me, Senator Dean. Senator Uzakos, your time.
Absolutely, absolutely.
No, your time is up.
Oh, will the chamber grant me 5 minutes?
Is it agreeable, honourable senators? 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Senator Uzakos. I rise to ask you a question, but I do want to start by correcting the record. Because you have said and others have stated here that it's important that we operate from the basis of facts and evidence. So I first of all can confirm that the Task Force on Cannabis did visit Colorado as it visited Washington. That is correction number one.
Question, Senator Dean.
Second.
I'm sorry. Is this a question? Is there a question, Senator?
What I would like is not to be interrupted. Secondly, I can say that because you asked about the 2013 UNICEF report, data was not provided or could not have been provided by the Department of Justice. I have investigated the source of the data.
Senator Dean, order please. Senator Dean, you have the right to ask questions. If you'd like to debate, that's a whole other question. But this is a question period.
And here's the question. I also do have a right not to be interrupted. So the question is this. Is the Senator aware that in 2014, Canada's premier research and treatment facility, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, which both myself and Senator Batters are fans of, and is a place that I would go to as a credible source for all information on research on drugs and addictions, that in 2014, the CAMH issued a policy paper which concluded that legalization and strict regulation of cannabis provides an opportunity to reduce the harms to kids. Are you aware that it concluded that cannabis is not a gateway drug? Are you aware that it concluded that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol and tobacco? Did you know about the report? Do you know about its conclusions? And would you like me to send you a copy?
First and foremost, I was in my speech referring to a UNICEF report that has been widely used in this place by ministers. 3 different ministers quoted that particular report. A number of senators, as a result of that, have piggybacked on that report. And after investigation, it was clear that that report was not founded on any evidence that could be substantiated, no methodology that could be substantiated. I went a step further and had the courtesy of asking the government leader a month ago to provide the source of that report, the methodology of that report, and the chamber is still waiting. I'm not familiar now of this new report you've just popped up, but you're more than welcome to table it so all colleagues can enjoy the benefits of perusing it and finding out what that report says. We also had a panel of experts come before the Senate here, and it was at the invitation of Senator O, of 5 doctors, respected pediatricians, and they did not equate alcohol with marijuana at the same level. They did not share the view that marijuana is not a gateway drug. So at this particular point, the only thing I was trying to point out in the speech that the government is using a narrative and saying they're trying to solve a solution based on the principle that Canadian youth is right now exploding with marijuana use. And I call into question that particular stat. We also have to be very careful. Whenever there's a polling or an analysis done when it comes to the usage of marijuana by any demographic group, yes, there's a large number of people that might use the drug in passing, might be at a party, might take a toke, and that might also spike the numbers. But the real numbers that need to be, for example, validated is how many people that are consistently using marijuana stick to it for prolonged periods of time. And then the question is, why hasn't this government, as a first step, and that's the point I was trying to make in my speech, if the objective here, Senator Dean, is to make sure that young people are educated and we bring down the use amongst young people in marijuana, and if the government is willing, is using that as their main focus point, it goes against your argument right now, which is alcohol is worse than marijuana. The government doesn't claim that marijuana is a terrible thing. They're not claiming that it doesn't have tremendous adverse effect on young people. And that's what I seem to get from your question, is the opposite point of view right now. But the government says, no, this is a terrible thing for young people, and we got to get young people to not use it. So what we're doing we're going to legalize it. And I'm just simply saying, I don't see that as a logical point of view. A first logical point of view, if you're genuine in your argument, and I'm suspicious that there isn't genuineness in the argument, put forward education.
Senator Zakos, your time is up.